Hello everyone and welcome to Hill Street. Today's story is The Puddles in My Town Are Acting Strange. If you end up enjoying this story, please leave a like. And if you enjoy hearing stories from me, please subscribe and become a resident of Hill Street and let me know how I'm doing in the comments. Now, let's get to this nightmare. I was putting up my Christmas lights when I first noticed the puddles. There had been heavy rain earlier in the day, and the ground was thoroughly soaked. But I live in a small town in Washington, and we're used to exceptional amounts of rain, so I thought nothing of it. I was absent-mindedly stringing the lights across my gutters when I moved my ladder into a rather innocuous puddle. I climbed the first step, and I noticed it. My ladder began to sink ever so slightly. I thought perhaps the puddle was just deeper than I had anticipated, and I hopped off and gripped the sides of the ladder to pull it up. And that's when I felt the tug downwards. My ladder didn't budge. Very confused and a little annoyed, I tugged even harder, to no avail. Instead of loosening the puddle's hold of the ladder, I noticed it was beginning to feel what can only be described as a suction force pulling the metal out of my hands. I jumped back and stared at the ladder, and sure enough, it sank lower, past the first rung, and then slowly more and more of my ladder disappeared beneath the shallow surface of the water. Eventually, half the ladder was gone, and I was able to shake myself out of my daze. I leaned down and looked at the puddle. I saw no signs of anything strange. Well, other than my ladder being eaten by the pavement, but I couldn't see anything wrong. I just watched as rung after rung of my ever faster sinking ladder disappeared into the ground. Soon enough, the last bit of ladder sunk down, and I watched it in shock as it vanished beneath the surface. No hint that it had ever existed at all. What I did next is pretty stupid. You could say I win the Darwin Award for this, but I had to know. I tried to dip my foot in the puddle. Hear me out. I had just witnessed my ladder disappear into a puddle, and I wasn't even sure if I was dreaming or not. I won't say it was smart, but I know at least some of you would have done the same. I slowly began to lower my boot into the puddle and held my breath. Immediately, my boot made contact. Nothing happened. I felt confused, alarmed, and heaved a sigh of relief. But my relief came too soon. The moment my foot touched the pavement under the puddle, I tried to release it and felt a tug. It was stuck fast, and before I had time to process this new information, I felt the pull. My shoe began to sink. Slowly, but steadily, I could feel the pavement pulling me down. I panicked and fought, but nothing was releasing my boot. After a few inches of sinking, I removed my foot from my boot and watched as it continued to sink lower and lower into the puddle. And soon, it too was gone. I was breathing hard at this point, partially from the panic of watching a puddle swallow my belongings, and partially from the knowledge that I had a magic puddle portal in my front yard, and no one would believe me. I wish I could say that was the worst of my problems, but that was when I heard the first person scream. I live in a rural area, so my neighbors aren't that close to me, but they're close enough that when my neighbor Tess let out a loud howl, I heard it. I tried to run to my front door to get a different pair of shoes to run over and help her, when, as I was hopping to my front door, I landed squarely in another puddle. Suddenly, I felt the dread sink in when my boot no longer pulled free from the ground. I quickly yanked my foot free from the boot and shakily placed both feet in a vacant spot on my patio, free from puddles. To my horror, the boot sank faster this time, noticeably faster in fact. I scurried around the remaining puddles and made it in my house. I collapsed by the front door, and once I regained my breath, I got some new shoes on before throwing on the news. People around Redacted woke up this morning to a nasty surprise. It seems the puddles around town had begun to swallow objects placed in them. Reports have been coming over from Redacted County to Redacted, and the general public has been warned to stay inside their houses until the National Guard arrives. I swallowed and bit my lip as I paced back and forth, trying to decide what to do. A scream rang out again, this time more urgent than before, and before I knew what I was doing, I bolted out my door towards Tess's house. Upon arriving, I saw Tess waist deep in a puddle. She was crying and screaming and struggling to pull herself out to no avail. She saw me and whimpered, "Please get me out of here. I'm sinking and I can't feel my legs." Looking at Tess, I could see she was by her car where a large puddle had formed next to the driver's seat. She was sinking quickly, and I searched to grab something to pull her out. "Do you have any rope or a large branch I can give you?" I began panicking. She was already up to her ribs at this point. "No, I don't have a freaking rope. Now come grab my arm and pull me up. I'm sinking," Tess shouted. She was in fight or flight and wasn't thinking clearly. The puddle surrounding her was large and deep, and I knew for certain we'd both die if I tried to stand in it and pull her out. I searched her front yard for anything to pull her out. I spotted a garden hose in her front yard and ran to grab it, carefully avoiding all the puddles along the way. I brought it back and tied it to a small tree on the edge of her driveway. "Here, grab this, quickly," I shouted and tossed her the hose. She grasped at it desperately and began to white-knuckle her grip on it. She was up to her armpits at this point. I watched as she tried to pull herself up, but the moment her upper arms touched the puddle, they too were stuck. She was sinking faster. "Please, I don't want to die," she peeped in a voice so small I could barely hear her. But before she could say anything else, her mouth slipped under the pavement. I got one last look into her eyes before they too sank under. They were the eyes of a trapped animal. Panic, sadness, and remorse clouded them. I sank down to the ground and began to cry. Before I could even compose myself, I noticed the garden hose I had tossed to Tess was slowly moving forwards towards the puddle. I looked back to see the tree bending further and further before the hose snapped and whipped across the pavement into the puddle and disappeared below its surface. I carefully made my way home and watched the news in horror. There was a man reporting on the ground and interviewing the folks from around my town. Some were more panicked than others. Most of the older folks were perplexed but didn't show any signs of distress. And then they interviewed a woman who was crying by the sidewalk. "Why are you crying? What's wrong?" the man asked in a hushed and soothing voice. The woman was racked with sobs and looked into his eyes. He's always allowed to splash in the puddles. That's his favorite thing to do. I went inside for just a minute. It was only a minute, I swear, she choked out, tears bubbling up and pouring down her cheeks. The man gave her a hug and told her she should go inside until help could arrive. She looked shell-shocked, but listened to the man and walked back to her front door in a haze, warily avoiding all the puddles on her driveway. I flicked off the TV. It's been hours since I went outside, and now I just stare at the puddles along my driveway and up my street. Every once in a while I hear an ambulance or helicopters, but for the most part, all is silent. My phone buzzed, and I walked across the room to the counter to grab it. It was an emergency alert. This is an alert for a redacted city. Please remain in your homes and await further instruction. Under no circumstances should you go outside. I stared at my screen for a moment before walking over to my couch and curling up on it. I pulled my blanket over myself and heard my cat gently pad her way across the house and into the living room with me. I was never more glad in that moment that she was an indoor-only cat. She jumped up beside me and began making biscuits. I just sat and stared at the blank TV. But that's when I heard it. I felt a deep sense of panic set in again and began to cry. The distinct sound of gentle rain falling on my window